Good morning. How's everyone doing? I'm very excited to talk about some of the work that I've been involved with here in Durham with a community-rooted organization. However, I'm going to come from a broad lens and foundation, theoretically, why we should be including community engagement, how it improves our actual policy outputs, as well as talking about power, because that is a recurring issue when we think about this integration of public and private interests, but also when we think about local knowledge and technical expertise. I am going to put my bottom line up front. There will always be a role for technical expertise. I say this because after almost 15 years of community engagement work, I would say this is the primary tension that we often have in a room where we've brought people with technical expertise and community knowledge together. This idea that to open up our conversations to community and local knowledge, that we are going to actually give up some of our expertise, that we will just be bent to the will of the public without thinking about the many years in this room, the students that I teach, the expertise that has been collected through their practice. That's not the case. And, however, technical expertise needs to be integrated with local knowledge. It can, it must, it should. It gets to issues of scale, so we'll talk a bit about scale of data collection and how that we are going to need that local knowledge at the core, because many of our methods are good at getting us generalizable knowledge, whether it's a survey method, but it will miss some of the why questions that are implicit in local knowledge. It'll also help us produce information that stakeholders understand and accept. One of the core tenets of conflict or dispute resolution is this idea that we need to have moments of joint fact-finding. With that joint fact-finding, we can have a shared informational base to go forward. It is when those two are put in conflict that we see certain conflicts explode, because I have my expert, but I did this Google search, or I found this expert that says something contrary, and now we have actually made it much more difficult to work together. And then we need to support the systems thinking that is already present in community-rooted organizations. Many folks that you're going to work with actually are already coming and understand how their systems of disadvantage, how their social stratification, how they feed into one another. That systems thinking is already there. We can build on that depending on different topic areas. Just because a particular group does not come and present to say that, you know, transportation is my #1 priority. That might not be the case, but affordable living is one of their #1 priorities, and transportation is part of that. I'm going to give you a little bit of background and motivation to the work that I do in this area. In particular, there's a growing body of research that shows as we improve our community engagement, we see the quality of our plans, of our ordinances, of our implementation improve. The idea that some of it is having the support, you have a group championing your work, as well as allowing us to just create better policy inputs to begin with. So we are able to then shape our intention, which is actually a lot of these planning documents. What do we intend to do? How it shapes our action or inaction, and then finally the impact. We have to, however, be very mindful of power. This is one thing that I've also seen, whether it's the students I work with or my interactions with many practitioners, that I'm a technocrat. There's no power implicit. I'm neutral. That's not the case. We all bring something to our jobs. We don't leave ourselves behind. But even beyond that, we see manifestations of power that aren't always what Luke calls the first face of power, which is, I'm going to make you do something you otherwise don't want to do. So if I am out with my goddaughter and she is really not about putting on that jacket, I have the power, mostly as an adult, to say, well, you're going to put on that jacket. We often think about power in those terms rather than the other two faces of power that Luke discusses. So we'll talk in particular about the second face of power, which is really getting to agenda setting. This idea that you have real power if you can set the agenda. If you can decide what's going to be argued about, you have power. We often do that with our technical expertise. So we need to be mindful of the ways that we're organizing information that is still setting the stage for the conversations we can have. And again, we'll try to illustrate that through some examples in Durham today. The third phase of power is really how can we shape people's preferences and values to the point that they think they want something, and it feels like, yes, my preference is to drive, but don't see all of the machinations behind the scene, behind the system that brings people to really value the car, and how that then makes us align a land use pattern, a transportation system, and systems of disadvantage to that value system. My work in particular uses community-based participatory research, where we are going to have collaborative and equitable partnerships. We are resource and asset-based. Part of the difficulty in many community engagement activities is constantly coming in and saying, there's a deficit here, there's a deficit here. Again, individuals know where there are deficits, where there are barriers, where there are challenges. But having that constantly articulated in a situation where you're very aware of it is mind-numbing, and it pushes people away from actually engaging. Instead, we want to talk about the capacity that is already within communities, build on that capacity, and really talk about co-learning. Not just, this is what you should do, this is the information I have, but how do we have a bi-directional exchange? And finally, constantly moving towards transparency. This is very difficult. How can I be transparent when I run all these statistical models? They won't have the data. Well, I'll just keep it close. Some of that transparency isn't necessarily about just community partners, but it is the larger community, whether it's the university, whether it is community-based organizations. It's allowing others to ground truth the conclusions that you're making. But shifting to Durham, I am a fan. I've been in this area since the early 2000s, and I've seen Durham shift from having the emptying out of the center city and now a renewed interest in the center city and the areas around it. I've seen some estimates that between 22 to 27 individuals move to Durham every day. To that end, we see an increased pressure in the neighborhoods surrounding the downtown area for housing. This is the 1937 residential security map, so they're often known as red line maps. The areas in red are historically black neighborhoods. These are the neighborhoods that we now see in Durham, where we're seeing increases in price per square footage between 100 to 400%. These are areas where they're close to the center city. They often have walkable infrastructure. They are also the places of systematic and historic disinvestment that makes them ripe for gentrification and displacement. But that conversation is often centered strictly on housing. And housing is important if we're talking about this larger concept of affordable living. However, these are also areas where we see long-term disinvestment in infrastructure. So sidewalks, streets, that also feed into the walkability, the safety of driving, the safety of pedestrian, trying to transverse this area. So I put up the residential, the red line maps or the residential security maps to remind us, and mostly because my work is with communities that have this history of systematic disinvestment. It cannot be ignored. It sets the stage for our conversation now, and it is this historic distrust that colors much of our community engagement now. We should not be surprised that we're not trusted partners, no matter what we're bringing to the table. It doesn't matter that we weren't there when these maps were used much more intentionally in setting policy. We still carry that baggage, and we need to acknowledge it. But to get to this first idea of agenda setting, this is from Durham's City County Residential Survey in 2016. The executive summary, when they're talking about multimodal transportation, this, the text is what actually is placed in the executive summary. We know how executive summaries work. There's some decision makers, this is all they're going to read about the entire document. It says 62% of respondents were very satisfied and satisfied with the ease of travel by driving. It puts this idea of driving and the ease of driving up front. It talks about the majority. We have 62%. What's hidden in the data and then does not become part of the conversation is this chart, which comes many pages later, where you can see that the ease of travel by walking, you only have 37% across those same two categories. Or the ease of travel by busing, the same 37% across that satisfied and very satisfied categories. Yet that wasn't part of the conversation that is coming out at the beginning of this particular report. Now there's many other reports, Go Triangle has reports, but again, when we think about how we're doing agenda setting and how we have to hold both ourselves, whether we're university academic partners, whether we're consultants, whether we're public sector practitioners, how are we ordering the conversation? Because even as they are presenting this data, they are shaping a conversation and have a very powerful position in how we talk about transportation. Another example would be, as they're talking about the residential survey, this is, again, from the executive summary, the use of Go Durham or the Bull City Connector. They're reporting that 11% of respondents had used the service, and then gave the primary reason for not using the service is they just preferred to drive, they didn't need the service at this 63%. Again, if you go back into the graphs, into their actual data, you can start seeing that reasons for not using Go Durham or the Bull City Connector, that question was asked only of respondents who don't currently use it. So you're not actually getting to the core of, I might still use the Bull City Connector or Go Durham, but I still have questions about it doesn't go where I need it to visit. It doesn't come rapidly enough. So we did a door-to-door household survey with community members in a neighborhood, Old East Durham, which we saw on the first map. They're very different data. So this, we've talked about the ordering and the agenda setting. This gets to the scale. We need to have citywide data. We need that to talk about how do we set policy. But in areas that we know there's been systematic disinvestment, where we know there might be a group that is using our services differently, we need to get down to that scale. And that's one thing that we're seeing at the neighborhood scale with Old East Durham. You have, in this case, 37%, I believe here, of people who are actually driving or taking the bus at least once a week. Not that 11%. You're seeing 9% that are taking it 5 or more times per week, 6 that are getting us into that 2 to 4 times, and at least 16% are taking it at least once a week. And then when we get into the satisfaction with public transit, we have people who are very satisfied. There's still satisfaction here. But there is a group that we should be talking to really get down to where can we improve. And so what I'm going to talk about is a number of formats where we can get to a different type of format of getting data from communities that will help us integrate it a little bit better. Part of it is the observation I've had over a number of years of public hearings and their downfall. Some of it is giving someone 3 minutes will lead them to be the most extreme as possible in their statements. I'm going to try to catch the attention of decision makers. It will force me to take a much more extreme position that can actually make it much harder to find a zone of agreement. That's something that the format does. It prefaces people who can come to public hearings, so it means that in many cases I have to be working the first shift, I have to have childcare, I have to prioritize it amongst many other things. How can we use some different formats that will readily allow us to integrate it into the information we have? And we're going to start with walk shops. Walk shops are mobile community-led workshops that use the neighborhood as an educational setting. Here you'll see a map, and so the map makes it readily able to integrate this information with GIS types of tools, where you have people being able to say, grab that narrative and say, Alston Avenue, they've widened this. It now has impacts for pedestrian crossings and safety. We have traffic issues, especially speeding in this area, and I'm putting a location to it. And then there's car and dirt bike speeding that endangers pedestrians, especially children playing in the street. So these areas that people are coming up very naturally as they walk around their neighborhood and are thinking about transportation. We also have used photo voice, and we found photo voice to be particularly useful for groups that otherwise would not be part of public hearing or public meeting formats. These pictures, dirty sidewalk, were taken by a middle school student who was given a camera and then went out and took pictures about how they're able to walk and navigate their neighborhood. We also have some photos that are coming from folks who had housing insecurity and were also able to reach a population that otherwise would not be within a lot of our public hearings. Here, the student had an additional narrative about this stays here for weeks. It's in it's not clear who should be removing it, if it's a public right-of-way tree, but it's pushing them into the street to walk around it, which places them at risk. The final format is community mapping. So again, time-intensive, people go out. This one can be executed in a much shorter time span. We did these at community potlucks. We have large-scale maps. We have people gathering. There might be some students in here who helped with this particular project, and they drop pins as they're talking about transportation. In this case, we had a big map that looked at transportation, a map that might have the transit routes. They talk about not enough buses. They're never on time. I have to wait another hour. Cars are moving. Again, we see this overlapping with the community workshops where cars are moving around, flying around a curve in a particular space, and I don't want to let my children go out and play. There's a lot of discontinuous sidewalks on one side, which again forces people to cross the street, again in places where there's speeding. So to end, what I really want to say is, how do we initiate this community systems thinking? Some of it is meeting communities where we are. We did not come to a community meeting and say, hey, let's talk. To get to the point where we could talk about transportation, environmental quality, economic development, affordable housing, we went through a whole process where we met the community where they were. Because they are going to end up talking about transportation issues, because it's about the larger system that they're living in. I know that I'm spending a lot on my car, but I need that type of flexibility so I can't do child drop off and make the bus for my transfer to get to my job. I'm using the car as a way of having flexibility, but it's not my preferred method. How do we then play upon and get to that person-environment fit that is inherent in people's conversations about their lives that will then allow us to build a safer system? Thank you very much, and these are the acknowledgements. Many people helped, but I want to call out Communities in Partnership as our community-rooted organization, and I guess I could take any questions. Yes? Yes.
I would love to talk more about it. One of my questions is, you talked a lot about disinvestments in particular areas, and those are areas where we now are receiving both federal and local funding to create alternative transportation projects, to have ADA accessibility, to connect existing community infrastructure and libraries and schools. And yet, we are in a very particularly momentous time in Europe's history where information is really on the rise. So these are the very projects that would help build up the community, and they're the very projects that realtors are putting on, houses like empty lots and selling them at enormous rates. It's very difficult to be an owner's representative and know how to navigate this because it comes at it from so many points. So I don't know what you could say to speak to that. It is, it's such a dynamic problem.
Yes.
Anything, I thought I was going enough. Anything that you could add to I don't know, either resources to read up on or basically how to balance, getting infrastructure resources to people without further marginalizing the folks that are being marginalized.
I think it gets to what a number of our speakers are going to talk to on this particular slide. It's the system. We don't want to say that we're not going to. Okay. I'm going to let someone else take care of that. There's some updates that I'd like to do. The challenge is that we don't want to continue not to invest in these areas for fear that it's going to push gentrification further. At the same time, we need to be taking action and supporting the organizations that are working on those issues. So what I am pushing to, so Durham actually has an amazing opportunity it's toying with doing equitable development plan, to doing widespread engagement and having a way of thinking through these investments. What it takes is thinking at that level while you're also supporting the community-rooted and community-based organizations that are taking action, whether it's a land trust, whether it is communities that are looking to create affordable housing in perpetuity, to hold back that tide, because at the same time it's the private market. We have realtors that are using language that is incredibly problematic when you talk about pioneers. It's your turn now. How do we, it's a great time to get in and push other people out. What we have to do is think about how, because if your job title is transportation, it's not that you're suddenly going to come over and be doing housing, but we have to have both the formal and informal structures to have those conversations. Because I know that there's other Durham city offices that are thinking about this issue. There's other nonprofits, but we don't want to add another workload as well. So how do we think about coming together, doing that work up front about how we're going to integrate so we don't have to do it piecemeal? Because as we do it piecemeal, it means that I'm going to make these infrastructure improvements, but I'm doing it at a time that it's going to increase the pricing for the land trust that was going to try to come in and get these homes. And I could have coordinated, but we didn't end up. So we could definitely talk about the types of organizations, both within the local government as well as outside, that we all have to be in coordination with, because we're all part of the system, and we can easily get ourselves into a negative feedback loop if we don't coordinate. No, there's no question.
I have a question too. I don't know. Thank you for your presentations. It sounds very good to me. And I have a questions. I work for the City of Durham Transportation Department.
Yes.
And I have a question here. How you implement your presentations as part of Vision Zero? Because the City of Durham just initiated the Vision Zero City of Durham. So I'd like to know how you implement, what part of your presentation can implement or try to Vision Zero projects or Vision Zero plans.
So how we initiated the projects to,
Yes.
So that's really
What
where.
is the important role from your presentation we can implement part of Vision Zero?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, because you've reminded me of a point that I think is key. We have, as practitioners, as academic partners, your workload is next level. The idea that I then have to go to community meetings to make those connections, I still need to overcome the trust and respect that can take. It took decades for us to get in this position. Why would we think that a single new position and a 6-month process will help us reset the clock? That's not actually possible. So I advocate the use of community-based, but even more community-rooted organizations as partners. One, if we can build trust as we think about having differential timelines, different funding sources to support community-rooted organizations, they will help you gain community entree so that you aren't, the stability of the relationship then becomes between an office, or a department and the organization rather than individuals. So if someone moves on, it's not that we've lost all the trust built. It is necessary because they are also held accountable by community members and can overcome some of the trust issues that will help us implement. But it is having to have a much longer conversation about our timelines. So we can stop thinking, yes, I can turn this around in 6 months when it took 60 years for us to get here. We have to think differently about funding. So we usually can't actually provide food using state funding at a particular event, but that's something that will bring people out. How can we then work with community organizations so that we are having a shared, it's helping push their mission forward as it's also helping integrate and make policy change, but it has to be, we have to commit to it. And I think that means that we have to have some institutional change. Okay, and I have come all the way up, so I'm definitely over time. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for those 2 questions. Our next speaker is Dr. Leah Frericks, an assistant professor in the Department of Health Policy and Management at the UNC School of Public Health. Leah's research focuses on the intersection of community-based participatory research and systems science to address health disparities. So today she'll be talking broadly about participatory methods and reflect out through several of her research projects. And we are just switching out. Carla? Well, come on up, Leah.
It's like a pit crew.
All right. Good morning, everyone. I'm really excited to be here and share with you some of my work that I do in engaged systems thinking for public health and the built environment. I'm going to share with you 2 projects today that I've worked on that really integrate and use 2 sort of broad approaches. On one end, community engaged participatory research. On the other, systems thinking and systems science. And a lot of my work pulls from either of these 2 approaches, and the best of both worlds is when I get them to both work together really well. But what do I mean by those approaches? Community-based participatory research. Danielle gave a really nice definition for me, so I don't have to do this. But basically, it's this collaborative approach, right, where we're trying to equitably involve community members, organizational representatives, and researchers throughout the whole research process. Now, the work, I just want to sort of put a note up there up front that the work I'll talk to you about today, the 2 projects that I'll share with you, I don't really consider full-on CBPR, but I'm drawing from pieces of CBPR, particularly aspects of trying to be co-learning and co-learning with youth. So the 2 projects that I'm going to share with you are really involving youth, high school students, teenagers, which sometimes I wake up in the morning and I'm like, why am I focusing on this? Because teenagers kind of scare me. But mostly it goes really well, and it's really exciting and rewarding when I get to work with youth and learn from them, and then also see them sort of learn and be inspired. I also draw a lot in my work from systems thinking. It's really, a framework for seeing interrelationships, where we're trying to see patterns. We don't want to just look at one specific factor and boil it down to that one effect. And we really want to understand the system of influences. And so to do this, we have tools, a variety of tools. And on the left side, we talk about we're trying to see wholes rather than parts, see things in the relationships. rather than isolation. So there's qualitative tools that we can use, and I'll share with you how I integrate some of these into my work with youth. Causal loop diagramming and behavior over time graphs. And then, we can take these qualitative diagrams and we can actually turn them into computational models. Because sometimes our brains, right, we can't really intuit these relationships and how they lead to behavior. So these can, building these into computational models can hopefully help us make better decisions. So the two projects that I'm going to share with you today are based in Nash and Edgecombe County here in North Carolina. In those counties, we do have higher rates of cardiovascular disease, and we have from their community health assessments that obesity, hypertension, physical activity, nutrition are really in their top 10 health priorities in those counties. The first project I'm going to talk to you about is called MAPSCORE. It stands for Meaningful, Active, Productive Science in Service to Communities. And this is really anchored in Rocky Mount. So this MAPSCORE program actually has its origins at the University of Chicago. Dr. Stacy Lindau and her team were really the innovators of this program. And I don't believe in recreating the wheel, and it was a great idea. So I was excited to get involved in it. It's been running for about a decade now, though our program in Rocky Mount we've been doing for about 3 or 4 years. And the mission, what we're really trying to do with this program is to train youth to produce high quality data about community assets that everyone can use, right, to improve the human condition. And so we work with 10 to 15 youth every summer. They get training in actually mapping community assets. They go out and actually map assets, as well as some aspects of positive youth development, leadership, communication, as well as kind of what is data and research, and they get training in that as well. I have a video, and we'll see if it actually works. I think we're just getting mostly the video and not the audio. It's okay because essentially it just repeats everything I just told you. It's just nicer to watch it in a fancy video. And then you don't have to see my big face up there, which is a little scary for me. But basically the process really does involve a lot of community partners. And so we work with a lot of organizations in the community to integrate their strengths into the work. So we come with some of the technical expertise in terms of mapping and some of the software that we use. But we, for example, work with community enrichment organization who is able to provide transportation for our youth during the summer. We work with OIC, which actually already has some youth programs in the summer, and so they help us to recruit the youth that are involved. So it really does involve a lot of different community agencies to put this program together. So as I said, the program, we collect data. The youth actually collect the data about the assets in their community. There's an app that they use on mobile phones that they go and physically walk through their community. They take addresses that they're assigned to. They go to basically public-facing organizations, companies, businesses, and they go and they map it. There's a set of criteria, questions that they have to answer about it. So, what kind of a business is it? Is it still active? Is it open? And so it involves just going in and talking to the people at the business as well. And sometimes people are like, well, why do you do this? There's Google, right? Like, why don't we just Google all of this? We're actually finding, especially in communities like Rocky Mount, that there's a lot of like small mom and pop businesses that aren't captured on Google. So we can collect this information. About like 30% of what they collect is not on sort of your main like web pages that you would go to. And it's really exciting to see youth be like, my laptop was broken. I didn't even know we had somebody who did sort of computer repair. And then through the process, as I said, they get some training in research and using data. And so they get to design their own little mini research project, answer some research questions, and see if they can use the data that they're collecting to answer those questions. So for example, I think there was a youth last summer who was interested in what are the mental health services in my community. And so they were able to go through and find out, how many actual agencies did mental health services, and then did a little bit more assessment, talking to community leaders about what was actually available, the strengths of these resources, what the weaknesses were. And then after the data is cleaned, it's uploaded and made accessible on a website so that the whole community can then access that information. And then we've also been working on some projects to proposals that we could hopefully try to integrate some of this information even into the electronic health record, so that physicians could actually counsel patients about different resources in their community to address health needs. So this second project I'm going to talk to you about is one that's in development. So hopefully someday we have an awesome, catchy program name, but right now we don't. I just call it my Youth Advisory Board. I'm hoping they come up with a great name. This work is based in Tarboro, so same counties, but just over a little bit in a somewhat smaller community. And I'm basically working with about 10 high school students. And the goal is really to work with them using systems thinking tools to really better understand physical activity and how the built and social environment might be influencing it and what we can do to improve physical activity among themselves and their peers. So as I said, I use some systems thinking tools in this training with them. So on the left, you see a causal loop diagram that we've worked on with youth, where we're not just trying to list out, right, what are the factors, what are the barriers, what are the challenges, but put these together and really understand how they interconnect. And then they get to really add their own perspective and input. I learned this Wi-Fi is so important because that's how they communicate, right, with their friends. And that they go to places like McDonald's, not necessarily just because of the food, but because that's where they can hang out. It's like a space for them to go. We've also used behavior over time graphs. So these are really so we can get away from just thinking about events, but thinking about trends over time. So this is an example on the bottom right from one of my sessions just last week with the youth. And we asked them to really map out what is their activity level throughout the day. And we're trying to understand what the patterns are. And it was interesting to see some patterns emerge about their sort of class and being in school and how that impacts their physical activity, and then how they have little 3-minute breaks in between classes where they have these little jumps of activity. And it occurred through a lot of different graphs. And then it was also, this is like the youth who was so quiet and organized, and her Post-it notes had to be like exactly in line compared to others who are just kind of all over the place. So through this project, like I said, it's in development right now. We're working with the youth using these systems thinking tools, and that's really going to help us bound this problem a little bit more and structure a simulation model that we'll build. But we're also going to do a study with them to gather data that will be used in the model. And we're going to use a mobile app to collect that information so that we can really gather a lot of information about physical activity, where they are, who they're with. And so that will happen actually beginning of the fall semester this coming year. And then we're going to re-engage with them using this simulation model to really try to determine what is the most effective physical activity interventions policies that we want to see and help them advocate for those policies and interventions. As I said, the study is going to involve using a mobile app to collect a lot of information. We're going to use smartphones. There's this app that we're going to use that actually pulls from their phone's sensors. We know that they always have their phones on them. So we'll get some information about their activity levels from the accelerometer, where they're at in space. And then we can also use some of the sensors to get actually who they're around, if they're around other participants. It's a little scary, but we'll get a whole lot of information from it that hopefully can be useful. And then be able to use, right, in a simulation model to be able to intuit these changes over time in activity levels if we change some of these parameters, and answer questions about, our social environments and who should we be targeting, or what are the built environment changes that might be the most effective at improving physical activity. So, those two projects, I hope give you sort of a glimpse of how I'm using sort of this integration of engaged research, piloting interventions, implementing, evaluating, and then using modeling in a sort of continual process, which I hope will help us find better answers in conjunction with the community, with the youth, and address some of the health disparities that we continue to have. Is there any questions? Take one or two.
Hey, Leah.
Hi, Steve.
This is Steve Marshall. I was going to say, how do you message to youth? Oh, thanks, please. Can I ask you, how do you message to youth that we want to capture all the complexity of your daily activities, and we want you to engage with this, kind of high-end modeling stuff?
Right.
Because people are drawn to simple things. Like, simple things feel good to us, and we want the easy solutions. So I'm just interested. I don't doubt that you can do all, I know you can do all of this. I'm just wondering how you message to your, especially the kids, to get their buy-in into the complexity part of it.
Yeah, I think actually the youth that are at least drawn to this, they're already bought in. They kind of understand. They also, I think, more of a draw than that this is complex is that they care about their communities, and they really care about their community health. So if we start there and then talk about how complex this is and that we can't just find an answer through education, it really sort of starts the conversation. And then when we start using some of these systems thinking tools with them, the diagramming, the behavior over time graphs, it's amazing how they're like, wow, I didn't realize that this was all going on, right? Because they've never explicitly put that out, put their mental models, put what's going on onto paper.
I mean, that's great. By the way, I mean to say, fantastic presentation. I'm very impressed by all of this work. So do you see them picking up those tools and applying them to other aspects of their community or other aspects of their lives? So do you think they start to take like behavior over time graphs and apply those to other problems in their community?
I can't answer like that I've seen that happen. I would love for that to happen. It certainly seems that they see the value in it as they're participating.
So I just want to add in that there are movements to try to trigger that. So community-based system dynamics is an approach to really build capacity to do what you're doing with these youth, in the hopes that it will continue, that these capabilities to do systems thinking live on to other projects. So there are movements to do this. There's also a good bit of evidence that kids are better at systems thinking than adults, that we get trained to not do this.
Mm-hmm.
That we're taught to think very linearly in school, and so there are movements to try to, beef up these skills among kids. So I think starting young is really exciting, and you've got a lot of leverage to really change the way people think about problems at that age. So I think it's really exciting. my question for you is I'm curious what your thoughts are. So this is a road safety crowd. And I think a lot of what you're doing around physical activity in the built environment, both the mapping and the sort of data collection with the phones and the wearables, could be really useful to studying roads and driving patterns and things like that. I'm just curious if you have any thoughts about how, what that might look like.
Absolutely, that's it's going to be integrated in the work, especially that I'm doing with youth, because a big part of what we're learning is not just physical activity, but their activity mobility patterns, right? Like how are you getting from place to place? And I think we can learn a lot, not just about the physical activity and exercise, but are you in your car most of the time? Are you on your phone, right? Where we'll be collecting data. So there's certainly a lot we can learn in that area as well.
Hi, you said that one of the aspects of the project was that the kids in the first project were encouraged to come up with their own research questions.
Yeah.
I just wondered if you had any favorites that you could share with us.
So my favorite shows my bias in my research, but I had, it was 2 years ago, some of the youth wanted to learn more about the parks in their community. And so they went out and they actually did formal sort of observations of several, I think 5 of the parks in their community. And it was partially my favorite because they had sort of this perspective coming at the beginning of like, oh, the parks in our community are just not good, they're kind of gross, but actually when they went and did the assessment, they actually learned that they weren't so bad.
Thank you. Our third speaker is Dr. Allie Thomas, Assistant Professor at the UNC Department of City and Regional Planning. Allie studies how best practices travel the globe. Specifically, she uses ethnographic research methods to understand how best practices in transportation are adopted in developing economies, such as China, where she can speak Mandarin. Her US-based work focuses on electric bikes and family travel. Today, she'll be sharing about her work to close the session with an international perspective. So please welcome Allie.
Good morning. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk about my research and to kind of discuss how collaboration works in a society that doesn't necessarily let you do community-based organizing. So this is what we're going to talk about today in terms of a transit-oriented development project that I did several years ago in Jinan, China, and then also talking about what I had to do along with some of my colleagues to see what was happening in the community and how to get the community into the plans. So this is where Jinan is. It's basically between Shanghai and Beijing. It's right in the center, just across from Korea. And as you can see, this is also how Jinan has grown over the years, and they call it the belt. So it's not necessarily a square, but more of a rectangle, and that's how it is actually developed over time. So in the center is where most of the downtown is, and in that square at the top is where our project was for transit-oriented development. And as you can see, the Yellow River is right above the project. So just to give you some ideas of some of the research we looked at in terms of like the actual space, we looked at it from various levels, including the regional level, in terms of where the project was, looking at it in terms of how it's going to be impacted by other developments that were happening at this time. So you had a West Railway Station, which is a high-speed rail station, and it has now been developed, and there is a high-speed rail line that goes from Shanghai to Beijing through the Jinan West Station. There's also a developed university city, which is what they call a new town in China. And these new towns often have a couple of different themes. This one was a theme around technology and also universities. So as China's moved to a more market-oriented economy, what you're seeing is that the land in the downtown has become very valuable. And so what they've been doing, particularly universities, is having satellite universities in these new towns. And so that is one way that they've done this type of development. So this is just one example. And then over on the right, you see what is called the Olympic area. And what they did was they created basically replicas of the stadiums, the bird's nest and so forth from the Beijing Olympics in Jinan, and also put their major government offices in this area. So this is just some of the development that was going on in Jinan at this time. Okay, so this is the development site looking at the city level, and this is what the traffic is like. So it's not a very safe environment for anybody really. And then here's what the original plan was for this development. And so at this site, already there were 30,000 people. This was an industrial site, and this is what the city's plan was. And so it was going to move from 30,000 people to 130,000 people, and some of the areas were already built up. So this is what they gave us as far as a map. And we did just brief back of the envelope analysis in terms of what would this look like as far as transportation. And just basically looking at what the current trips were in terms of 2.3, and then looking at the mode split. So we were going to see heavily increase in traffic. We were also projecting a higher use of cars at this time. So this is the footwork part. So we have this proposed idea from the planning organizations. And we were working as a joint collaboration with an international foundation, the University of California at Berkeley, and also local planning institutions. So there was no community organization that we were working with. We were working with the government. So from these plans, we were then going into these neighborhoods to see what was actually on the ground. And what we found were a lot of smaller, dense communities. And what we later learned was what often happens in China is that the city expands and then takes in villages. So the circles that you see are the original village communities, and so their footprint is much smaller. And as you can see, the yellow area in that square, those are all these types of smaller, dense village communities. So it's an urban village. And in terms of trying then to think about this community, because they were going to probably be displaced, how then could we consider, or value, them in our plans? Because we couldn't necessarily speak to them or necessarily say we could speak for them, but we needed to understand how, what was going on the ground, what they needed, and also to think about, ways of making it more equitable. And it is part of what has been said in previous presentations about the agenda setting. So one of the things that are taken very seriously in China are the plans. And so we've looked at this in terms of the collaboration of thinking about how we could incorporate some of these ideas and concepts in our plans and our proposals for them for the transit-oriented development. So again, this is what it looks like on the ground. So what we did at this time was we went around and talked to people in the community, but we did not talk to them as foreign experts, but just as tourists who are walking around checking out what's happening to see what was going on and who people were and what their jobs were. And by doing that, we got an idea of who the people were that were living in this community originally. And what we found were a lot of laid off workers. And so what they were having to do is sell products like this on the street. We also asked them about, you know, questions around like, oh, you know, what do you have to do to sell that stuff on the street? Do you have to have like a permit or something? Or can you just do it? And like, so we learned a lot that way. And again, just being curious and not saying who we were. And also, we didn't necessarily share all of our information with the local government either. We were very sensitive about that as well. But to think about, you know, if we're going to displace people, is there a more humane way to do that? Is there ways that we can actually keep them there and still get all of the goals that the local government wants for this property? Are there ways that we can encourage the developer to think about this group, this community, maybe saving some of the building footprint, maybe giving them better quality housing, but keeping it similar in terms of density? So again, like I said, our collaboration wasn't necessarily that we were having open meetings, talking to the community, things like this. This was not necessarily something that would be allowed. But we did, as we said, you know, acted like young foreigners, not as foreign experts. We, again, walked all over the area. We took pictures. We really just tried to get as much as we could into the planning of it. And then also, we presented our findings to the local planners, like this is what we found. A lot of things, we also found developments that were not supposed to be there. We found all sorts of things that were going on that the local planning department did not know. So part of it too, in terms of convincing, was to show that we had actually done our footwork, that we not just depend on like the plans, and then also looked at like, here are the things we found. So some of the stuff, even the local planning department didn't know about. So in terms of collaboration, it was also like how we did our work also was a way of co-learning. Like this is how we would approach this project, which is very different from what goes on in some planning offices in China. We then took these findings in terms of showing what they could do with the land because they were interested in incorporating transit-oriented development into this new plan. And so we had 2 urban design studios at Berkeley provide different types of ideas and designs, and also to think about certain contexts and so forth. So again, emphasizing and putting within these plans a way of seeing how to incorporate equity as well as density, and also addressing transportation issues. So in some of our early proposals with this space, you know, again, we're going to have high increases in terms of traffic demand. So we also looked at ways of incorporating land uses, increasing the road network, but also maintaining some of these urban village areas. So you can see in the lighter yellow color, like right here, these, you know, are areas that are part of the urban village. So not necessarily displacing them, but seeing that we can still have the high density, we could still incorporate certain things that they wanted, and that also we'd have a better traffic pattern. And then at the same time, giving them actual visualizations, which is important because you can sit there and say, oh, you should do TOD and your block sizes should be whatever, and you need to have a more human scale. But what does that look like using actual planning regulations from the local context? So this is a 100-meter wide street that is required because, like I said, this project is right below the Yellow River. What they want to do is build a tunnel under this to go under the Yellow River because they're planning on developing north of the Yellow River. So this was a requirement. There's no say. So then how can you make something that's about 300 plus feet wide more humane to cross and incorporate different ways of different modes? And again, it's not going to be a perfect design because it's 100 meters wide, but thinking about in terms of then how do we think about, particularly if you've got a mode split in which you still have about 30% of trips by walking, 30% of trips, 25 by bike or electric scooter, they're still going to be here. So we need to have space for them. So part of that also in terms of collaboration, in terms of thinking about the community, is also incorporating them into designs and showing how that can actually be, incorporated. And again, this is ideas about what it looks like and so forth. And that's really important too, is like being able to have people visualize a space in a very different way, particularly because we're looking at it from very different cultures, and that's another part of like understanding collaboration. So it happens at different levels, it considers different aspects, and again, we're in a situation where trying to organize a group of locals in some ways could be seen as, and it often is, illegal. So how then do you think about quality of life, understanding how people want certain things for their community, but also understanding that you have a local government that also needs to develop this land, because that's one of the ways that they pay for their infrastructure. So lessons that we learned in China and that I still continue to do today is I do my footwork, and the footwork can be many things, particularly if I'm trying to collaborate and do work with people who may not be heard in the plans. And so often that is just taking walks, going out there, documenting, not acting as, you know, an expert, but really asking questions of people. And because I do speak Chinese, and because often, you know, I don't look like the, you know, usual American, I get away with like asking a lot of questions. And also taxi drivers are, you know, important. So local knowledge, you know, in terms of places where you're not able to come together in groups, you can figure out in different ways, and you have to be a little bit, you know, trickier about it and savvier about it. And like I said, collaboration counts on multiple levels. So we did work with the local planning organizations. They did want to understand, how does this look like, these concepts of transitory development look like in a Chinese context, using various national laws and local regulations as well. And then also limitations. So in some cases, being a foreigner and being a foreign expert is very helpful, because you can convince leaders, because oftentimes they'll listen to your foreignness more than they'll listen to the local Chinese expert who is saying probably the same exact thing that you are, but for whatever reason, that leader may think that that is more valuable because you're coming from a more developed country, etc. And then other times it's just good not to be the foreign expert and just to be one of, you know, many basically. So, you know, in terms of like collaboration, in terms of dealing with the community, again, looking at it from a context of a non-democratic society, you have to be a little bit more open to doing things a different way and kind of going with the flow. But I think that what is important is these are same lessons that we've heard in many of the same presentations that are what we're doing here in North Carolina. It is actually like looking at what is the local context, how do people move in that space, what is important to them, talking to them at their level in terms of, you know this place better than I do. And so a lot of stuff that I've learned in China, I apply to my work here. I don't know, especially since I'm not from North Carolina, I don't know a lot. So I have to ask a lot of questions. And by just coming up with asking these questions and trying to get to know what's happening, I'm not coming in with an agenda set. I don't know what's happening, so you need to tell me what you seem to think. And then also, in terms of my own footwork, going and looking at different resources, hearing, you know, getting my own, you know, I also, as an undergraduate, had a Chinese history degree in modern Chinese history, so I knew what had happened in these areas as well, why there was this change in planning, and that was also helpful. So understanding the history is also an important aspect of working in terms of collaboration. So going back to what was said by Danielle, is also understanding like, okay, how are people perceived? And that's the same thing in China. How are foreigners perceived? How are certain foreigners perceived versus others? And understanding the historical context, particularly when you're dealing with global relationships. So, you know, really treading lightly in many cases is the best as well. And so in terms of like things that I want to do going forward in China, I'm also working on projects in which China now is a place and space of disseminating best practices, and they're working with a lot of developing countries in providing urban planning education. So I'm looking at that in terms of what does that collaboration look like between China and other developing countries. And I'll close with that. So if there's any questions, just let me know. Thanks. Okay, no problem.
Kylie got us back on time. Are there any other questions for other two speakers before we close? Okay, well with that, we will take a break. The lunch and keynote at 11:30 on self-driving car safety. It's complicated, but let's give our speakers one more round of applause.